Children of the Stones by Jeremy Burnham and Trevor Ray. Chapter 5. During the next few days, Adam and Matthew carefully checked each other's findings. For Matthew, the work was a relief after struggling all day with the problems Miss Clegg set him. She seemed pleased with his progress, not at all worried that he was still so far behind the geniuses at the high table. She kept assuring him that he would soon catch up. Compared with Sandra, Kevin, and Jimmo, however, it was Matthew who was the genius. They were as far behind him as he was behind the others, so that he found himself in a group of one, halfway between knowledge and ignorance. And he knew which one he preferred. If knowledge turned one into a smirking zombie, then give him happy ignorance every time. When Adam asked him how he was getting on at school, he'd been deliberately non-committal. He didn't want to worry his father while he was so busy with his research, and in any case, what could he say? That some of the kids were so much cleverer than he? That they always did as they were told, and never did anything wrong? Adam would wonder what he was complaining about. So, he continued to do the best he could, ignoring the complicated equations which the bright children seemed to solve with such ease, and concentrating on the problems that were within his reach. And as time went on, these became progressively more difficult, taxing his considerable ability to the utmost. He was always glad to get home. Tired and hungry, he would dive into Mrs. Crabtree's teas with gusto, then, carrying a triple-decker sandwich up to his bedroom, would sit for hours at his desk, poring over his father's astronomical charts, trying to solve the mystery of the stone circle's non-alignment. For Adam had been right. The circle appeared to have no connection with any known celestial body, yet it must have been constructed for a purpose. Other circles, such as Stonehenge, proved that Neolithic man's knowledge of mathematics was astonishingly advanced. What, then, was the purpose of the Milbury ring? Matthew's pride and joy was a small reflector telescope which his father had given him for his last birthday. He had set it up at his bedroom window, and night after night he would gaze up at the sky, scanning it, section by section, searching for some uncharted star to which the circle might be aligned. But it was a forlorn hope. Everything visible would surely have been plotted years ago. Since Adam had hinted that Matthew might unwittingly have solved the problem, he had remained strangely secretive. When Matthew had asked him what he was supposed to have solved, his father refused to answer, promising to let him know as soon as he had checked all the stones. So Matthew had no alternative but to conduct his own research, which was leading him precisely nowhere. Sometimes after school, he would accompany Sandra back to the museum. He found it a fascinating place, and with Margaret always ready to explain the various maps and charts, he had learned a great deal about Milbury's history. He was particularly intrigued by the Lee lines, which Adam dismissed as so much hogwash. But that was the trouble with scientists. They weren't interested in unsubstantiated theories, and Matthew was convinced that science couldn't provide all the answers. So he'd made his own copy of the Lee line map and hung it on his bedroom wall above his desk. One evening, as he was browsing around the museum, Adam appeared. He looked tired, but exhilarated, as if his investigations had at last borne fruit. "Send this telegram for me, would you, Matt?" he said, handing him a scrap of paper and a 5-pound note. "And make it express." Matthew glanced at the address. "Mount Palomar Observatory, eh?" Adam grinned. "That's right." You found your answer, then? I think so. Or rather, you have. Margaret rose from her desk to join them. The answer to what? Come here, and I'll show you. Adam took her arm and guided her to the glass case that contained the model of the village. Matthew followed, peering over his shoulder. A few days ago, Matt made an interesting discovery. He found that every one of these stones was upright, geometrically upright, at an angle of precisely 90 degrees. Margaret looked puzzled. So what does that prove? It doesn't prove anything, but it suggests an interesting possibility. So interesting that I thought it was worth making a thorough check. It's taken me time to complete it. All right, let's have it. Adam bent over the glass case and stared thoughtfully at the model. I think it's possible, only possible, mind you, that the circle is aligned upwards. If the stone dish underneath it was designed as a receiver for these psychic forces of yours, then it follows that the signals must come from a source directly above. Sounds a bit far-fetched, said Margaret doubtfully. No other circle is aligned like that. I know. But the fact that there's been no subsistence at all for 5,000 years must mean that the stones are socketed into the rock, which suggests that the angle was of paramount importance. Matthew whistled softly. So it could be a kind of primitive jodrell bank, immovably aligned with something up there. That's right. But what? Adam shrugged. I'm hoping Mount Palomar can tell us. There's nothing charted on the alignment path. Nothing. Margaret stared at him incredulously. Nothing visible. Then there goes your theory. I simply can't believe that a Neolithic archpriest designed all this to do nothing. No. But it's just conceivable that there could be some obscure power source up there. That might be best left alone. Adam shook his head, smiling. Where would science be if we stopped asking questions? Go on, Matt. The sooner we send these coordinates off, the sooner we'll know the answer. How long will it take them, Dad, to check the alignment path? Not long. If there's anything there, it'll be catalogued. Matthew ran out, climbed onto his bike, and raced through the village to the post office. He arrived, breathless, just as Mrs. Warner was closing up for the day. She stood in the doorway, beaming down at him. By now, Matthew was a regular customer. Just in time, she said, her eyes twinkling behind her thick glasses. Another minute and you'd have missed your ice cream. It's not an ice cream, Mrs. Warner, panted Matthew. It's a telegram. A telegram, eh? Must be important, then. Come inside. She moved behind the small window at the back of the shop. Now then, have you got the message all written down? Yes. Matthew slid the piece of paper under the window. Mrs. Warner read the words carefully, her smile gradually fading. You can't send this, dear, she said quietly. Why not? It's to America. The USA. She was treating him like a child, and Matthew began to feel irritated. You don't expect me to send smoke signals, do you? But it'll be expensive. Do you realize how much it would cost? He slapped the 5-pound note down on the counter. This ought to cover it, and I'll have a pop at the change. She picked up the note and stared at it as if it were forged. Very well, dear, she said reluctantly. If you wait a moment, I'll tell you how much it comes to. She disappeared into the back room. Matthew frowned after her. What was it about these pleasant village women that made him dislike them so much? There was something false about her, just as there was about Mrs. Crabtree. He preferred people who let you know what they were thinking, even if they were surly and bad-tempered. But he couldn't stand this continual pleasantness. It was like a hard, smooth shell which was impossible to penetrate. Only once had there been the slightest crack in the shell, and that was when Mrs. Warner had read the telegram. Matthew had carefully memorized the coordinates that Adam had worked out, and when he got back to his bedroom, he looked them up in his book of astronomical charts. But it was a fruitless search. The narrow strip of sky that passed directly over the circle seemed to be completely empty. He propped the book up on his desk and stared at it, disappointed. It just didn't make any sense. If the circle had been constructed with a consistent 90-degree alignment, as his father had suggested, then there ought to be something there. Perhaps they were on the wrong track. Adam poked his head round the door. "Hi." Matthew grunted, still preoccupied with the chart. Adam moved up to stand behind him. "The alignment path?" "Uh-huh." "Seems to be within the constellation of the Great Bear." "That's right." "And there's nothing there." "I told you." Matthew looked up at him. "Could it be a void?" "Unlikely." "Had supper yet?" "I had a sandwich." "Oh, yes. What revolting mixture did you come up with this time?" Matthew grinned. He enjoyed watching his father's taste buds curl up. "Ham and banana, with gherkins, and honey." "Well, you let me eat school dinners." Adam crossed over to sit on the bed. "School. You don't talk much about that. How are you getting on?" Matthew glanced at him and looked away quickly. "All right," he said edgily. "I've made a few inquiries about Miss Clegg. Apparently she's a math specialist. Should have thought that was right up your street." "Yes." "Not too difficult for you." "I can do the stuff she gives me." Adam frowned. "So? What's wrong?" "Nothing. If you're finding it all too easy, it's not that." "What then?" Matthew stood up, crossed over to the window, and started fiddling with the knobs of his telescope. There was nothing for it. He would just have to try and explain. "There seems to be two lots of kids," he said, choosing his words carefully. "Some are just ordinary, and the others are..." He paused, searching for an accurate description. "Extraordinary." "Yes. In what way?" Matthew turned and leaned on the windowsill. "They're brilliant, Dad. I mean, really brilliant. Some of them are younger than me, yet they're doing problems I can't even begin to understand." "Really?" Adam looked impressed. "But there's something else. The brilliant ones are so quiet." "Compared with you, you mean?" "No. Somehow they don't behave like kids at all." "Because they're quiet." "Because they're not natural." Adam heaved himself off the bed and stretched. "I've heard some complaints in my time, but grumbling because your mates are too quiet is a new one. I wish I had the same cause for complaint." Matthew grinned. "You'd be bored out of your mind. Try me." Adam suddenly noticed the Lee-line map on the wall. "What's that?" "Lee lines. I copied them from the map in the museum and replotted them slightly." "Why?" "Because they interest me. I've I've told you before, it's all a load of rubbish. Matthew crossed over to the map and unpinned it. It is a fascinating theory, though, that the circles are storehouses of psychic energy connected by invisible cables in a worldwide grid system. Adam yawned. A theory is only fascinating to me if it's based on sound scientific principles. Don't be so stuffy, Dad. I want to show you something. Matthew laid the map on his desk and picked up a pencil. Now, apparently, Lee lines never go through a point, but they always touch it at a tangent. Well, these don't. Every one of them comes straight up to one of the stones and then stops. How inconsiderate of them. That's assuming the point that they're supposed to be touching is in the circle, but what if it was much smaller? What if the actual power center was inside the circle? For the first time, Adam began to look interested. You mean the geographical center? No. Watch. Matthew picked up a ruler and projected 3 of the lines into the circle. They formed a small triangle. I could have done that with any one of the lines, and the result would have been the same. Adam bent over the map and peered closely at it. There's a house inside that triangle. Highfield House. Yes. Matthew circled it with his pencil. Wonder who it belongs to. I'll ask Margaret, said Adam, making for the door. I promised I'd take her to the pub tonight. Matthew grinned at him. Hello, hello, hello. The anorak did the trick, did it? Adam grinned back. Don't wait up, he said nonchalantly. I might be quite late. And he was gone. Matthew picked up the Lee Line map and studied it intently. 53 of them, all converging on Milbury. Margaret had told him that no other place in the country claimed so many. A mind-boggling thought suddenly occurred to him. Suppose this village was not merely a power center, but the power center. Adam let himself out of the cottage and began to walk through the village toward the museum. It was so dark that he had to stop several times to get his bearings, but it wasn't until he passed the pub that he realized why. There were no lights anywhere, not even in the center of the village where the street lamps lining the main road were usually shining brightly. It was still comparatively early, yet the whole village seemed to be deserted. He tried the door of the pub and found it locked. He walked around the back, but there was still no sign of life. Where on earth was everybody? At least the museum was open. Margaret, looking very attractive in a smart tweed suit, was sitting at her desk opening some letters. Adam had never been so glad to see anybody. She looked up as he entered and gave him a bright smile. Won't be a minute, she called gaily. Just catching up on my correspondence. No hurry. He perched on the edge of her desk. It doesn't look as if we should be going anywhere. She paused in the act of opening a buff envelope. What do you mean? The pub's shut. In fact, the whole village seems to be shut. Everyone seems to have disappeared. She stared at him. Again? It's happened before. About a month ago. What do? Turn into werewolves or something? No idea. But now you know what I mean about being alone. She opened the bottom drawer of her desk and produced a bottle and 2 glasses. We'll just have to have our own private property. Private party. Adam inspected the bottle with approval. That's what I like. A woman who's prepared for all eventualities. She poured the drinks, handed him one, and raised her glass. Mud in your eye? Likewise. They sipped their drinks in silence for a moment. Then Margaret picked up the buff envelope again. Mind if I finish this? It's always such a relief when it's over. When what's over? When I've read every crackpot letter? She picked up a sheaf of letters from her wire tray. You wouldn't believe the number of maniacs who write to me every day, each one with his own harebrained theory. UFOs, second comings, alchemy. You name it. She pulled a letter out of the pile. Here's one of my favorites. I have definite proof that Merlin built Stonehenge in Ireland and later flew it to Wiltshire. There remains no doubt that Stonehenge was originally a prototype spacecraft. Adam laughed. Powered by what? Oh, that's easy. Psychic energy. Don't start all that again. He wandered over to the glass case containing the model of the village, while Margaret tore open the buff envelope. Bluestones, he said thoughtfully. I wonder if the rock dish is a bluestone too. She didn't appear to hear him. Thank heavens for that, she said, kissing the piece of paper she was holding. It's a bill. Adam bent over the case, staring at the miniature rocks. Imagine the problems of quarrying things that size with those primitive tools. Flint axes. Yes, it must have been soul-destroying. Not soul-destroying. They must have been inspired by some sort of religious fear, some visionary longing that kept them going. It must have taken months to quarry a single stone and trim it into shape. Then transport it. Perhaps by sea from Wales. On rafts. He moved slowly back to her desk. There must have been a need. A sheer need to carry through such a project. Yes. She put the pile of letters back into her basket. The archpriest must have been a mixture of Galileo and Attila the Hun. A madman with a dream. Madman. He gulped down the rest of his drink. No, I don't think so. Then what do you think he was after? Power. I think he was trying to create his own power center. Which reminds me, who owns Highfield House? Mr. Hendrick. Why? Matt projected some of the ley lines of yours into the circle. They formed a triangle around Highfield House. He had some idea that it was the real center of the grid system. Margaret rose and walked over to the map on the wall. Fascinating. I wonder if Hendrick knows, said Adam, following her. About ley lines? I should think so. He's pretty well informed about the local phenomena. How old is the house? It's Elizabethan, but it was built on the site of earlier houses. Then if your theory has any validity, that site would have had some significance. It's possible. He's a bright boy, your Matthew. Adam tried to look modest. Can't think where he gets it from. She turned to face him, smiling. How about another drink? Thanks. She moved back behind her desk and refilled the glasses. I remember the last time everyone did a vanishing act. We drank a toast to absent friends. Who's we? I was having dinner with Dr. Lyle. He's the new doctor and a farmer called Browning. Nice, ordinary people. And what did they make of it? Oh, they had no idea. I mean, they were just... She stopped abruptly, looking blank and confused. Adam took hold of her arm. They were what? Margaret? They were... She slumped down in her chair and stared moodily at her drink. They were recent arrivals, too, she said softly. Matthew was sitting at his telescope in his pajamas and robe, staring down at the reflector plate. He had fixed the instrument according to Adam's coordinates so that it would scan the circle's potential alignment path, but so far his observations had merely confirmed what the chart had shown. There was not one single star or planet visible in the area. He slowly adjusted the focus, aiming for a sharp image. For a moment, the plate remained obstinately blank. Then, gradually, dim shadows began to appear. He couldn't make out what they were at first, but as they became clearer, he saw that they were human shapes and that they were moving slowly around in a circle. He took his eye away from the lens for a moment, then looked again. Some of the shapes had now broken away from the circle and were fleeing from a blinding source of light in the center. Those farthest away from the light had stopped and were beginning to grow and solidify, as if they were turning into... There was a sudden loud crash behind him. Matthew whirled around, his nerves jangling. His picture, which he had hung on the wall near the door, had fallen off its hook and was lying on the floor. He crossed slowly over to it, picked it up, and inspected it closely. Yes, there was no doubt about it. The strange vision he had seen on the reflector plate was an animated replica of the painting. Bewildered, he hung back the picture on the wall and returned to his chair by the window. He suddenly felt very dizzy and rested his head on his arms for a moment, waiting for his mind to clear. Something landed on the table in front of him with a muffled plop. Startled, he looked up to find a pebble with a tattered piece of paper wrapped around it, resting by his elbow. He picked it up, stared at it uncertainly, then unwrapped the paper. It was the bicycle drawing he had left in Di's trap. He stood up and peered out of the window into the impenetrable darkness below. "Di," he called softly. "Are you there?" No reply. He turned, wrenched open the door, and ran downstairs into the garden. "Di?" he called again. "Is it you?" Still no reply, but wafting through the night air came a low, indefinable sound that chilled him to the marrow. He froze, trying to make out what it was and where it was coming from. He had never heard anything like it before, but the fragment of a poem he had once learned came into his mind. The murmur of innumerable bees. Could they be bees? No. The sound was too organized, its pitch rising and falling in a cadence that no insect could reproduce. Then what on earth was it? His heart beating wildly, he ran down the path, opened the gate, and set off through the village, so engrossed in the sound that he didn't hear Di urgently calling his name. He ran on and on, as if hypnotized, stumbling through streets, climbing fences, swarming over walls, bulldozing his way through gardens, taking as direct a route as possible. As he drew nearer, he suddenly realized what it was. People chanting. Not the tuneful chant of a church congregation, but more unearthly, more haunting, more primitive. He stopped by one of the stones and bent down to catch his breath. The sound was very close now, originating from somewhere beyond a nearby hedge. As he straightened up again, he found he was able to see over the hedge into the garden of a large, imposing-looking house. But it wasn't the house that attracted his attention. It was the ring of people that surrounded it. They were facing outwards, holding hands, and moving slowly around in a circle, chanting as they went. Among them, Matthew recognized Mrs. Crabtree, Mrs. Warner, Miss Clegg, Bob, and all the children from the high table at school. He stared in utter amazement. It was a modern recreation of his painting, with the strange chant as an unmusical accompaniment. What they were doing, he couldn't begin to guess. It looked like some ancient ceremony of great importance to the participants, because the rapturous expressions on their faces were terrifying in their intensity. He heard a soft footstep on the grass behind him. He started to turn, but it was too late. Someone grabbed his arms, pinioning them to his sides, and he felt himself being dragged sideways. He tried to steady himself, but his captor was too strong. The band of steel that encircled him grew tighter and tighter, pulling him further and further away from the house. Then, suddenly, the vice-like grip relaxed. He stumbled, completely off balance, and he felt his hand touch stone. Instantly, his mind erupted in a blaze of pain, a momentary, blinding flash of agony. Then, gratefully, it slid into unconsciousness.